And staying for a bit longer with local access and privilege escalation, let's put it in order, right? So privilege escalation can be of two different types. Yeah, so first of all, it's horizontal privesc, that is basically one user getting access equivalent to other users' permissions. So this can happen in many different ways. For example, instead of differentiating between the users and giving different users different explicit permissions on the objects in the system, administrators have allowed all the members of a certain group to access a particular file or device or whatever. So this can be one way of exploiting horizontal privilege escalation. But remember that in this case, overall level of permissions in the system, in the technical perspective, is pretty much the same. Yeah, and vertical privilege escalation happens when a low privileged user gets higher permissions, higher privileges. So a normal user is becoming a system administrator and local administrator of the system, or something similar. Okay, so examples can be exploiting a local vulnerability that is not fixed in the current version of Windows. This happens all the time, so local exploitation is hard, but still there are different ways you can try to do that. And once you are in the system with the low-level user permissions, you can, of course, you have to search for business critical information available to this particular user, because sometimes this is enough to show the business value of your actions. But to go further and progress in your control extension, control spreading over the network, you have to escalate, and you have to first, for example, try reviewing the patches, the security updates that are already installed in this Windows operating system, and find if some specific exploits or vulnerabilities are not patched. Yeah, so you can try them, download them, compile them somewhere, and then download to this system and then run and get elevated privileges. Some other ways, purely operational security related, to escalate the privileges are, for example, finding some files that have left from the unattended installation process. So there is this specific procedure that is strongly automated. Yeah, so when a system administrator wants to install a lot of instances of an operating system, this happens a lot in the cloud environments or in large enterprises where there are a lot of users and I don't know, a bunch of new hardware comes in, and you have to initialize all that, install the normal business toolkit used in the company, right? No one really wants to do that manually, so there is this functionality in Windows, unattended install, that is configured by configuration files, normally in XML format, and there are places where you can look for them. So if they are not explicitly removed from that machine in the end of this procedure, this might happen if the procedure is not finalized. Yeah, so some final steps were not performed for, I don't know, for some reason, some mistake has occurred in previous stages. So the system is there, it's running, and the system administrator is okay with that, but there are some leftovers. Or there is this relatively new technique of finding a group policy file, an XML file that contains information about a local administrator user. So there is this very specific thing that is a feature basically of Active Directory group policies that are of course available to all domain members, to all machines that are within specific Active Directory domain. On the specific share on the domain controller, there is a file that is read by every machine every time the group policy is deployed, and it basically contains the information about usernames and passwords that should be created on all the machines, and given local administrator permissions, which is kind of cool. Okay, because as you understand, adding a domain administrator, a specific centralized user that is the same for every machine, right, and is not stored locally on each machine, but should be requested every time from the domain controller for verification when this user is trying to access the machine, is a much less secure approach. So it's better to have some user that is having a password that is stored locally on each machine, and if machine is compromised, it's lost or stolen, it's not a problem to just change the value of this password in the group policy and then deploy that policy again and check that it is applied on every machine in the domain. So it's easily automated and it's a cool thing to do, but there is one problem to that. This password in this group policy file is it's basically encrypted, symmetrically encrypted with a known key. Okay, so there is even a tool to recover that value. So if you find that, you are lucky. So first thing you do, if you have access to a domain member or you have access to existing domain user credentials, you go to that share, to sysvol, and find this group policy file and check whether there is some information like that, because that's quite a popular trick that many system administrators use to keep their workstation park in order. Okay. One other way to escalate privileges is actually misusing the permissions given to a service. So services, the program that is normally run, it is started on the boot of a server, and it is run all the time the server is active, and the server might not be only this dedicated server machine, that could be any workstation as well, but as long as it runs some services, it is considered server in the architecture. So the trick here is that this service has a binary, so-called image, so just a simple program that is run in the beginning of the server execution, and is kept in memory for all the time the server is up, and it can be rebooted manually or automatically, but normally it's just there, and it has permissions because it has some user account it is run within. Normally it's typical user account like local service or network service or specifically created account for that purpose. But if the image of this service can be rewritten somehow by some other user, this can be exploited. Yeah, so you can, for example, rewrite, you can stop the server, you can rewrite the image by your executable that you have just created, and then you can run the service again. Or you can rewrite the service and then restart it, yeah, if it's possible, if it's not controlling its source during execution. Or if you can you can find yourself in situations when you cannot rewrite the file, or you cannot manually stop or start the service, but you can somehow cause the denial of service condition. Yeah, so you can just trigger service restart, and you can automate that to the extent that in this particular period of time, a few fractions of a second, when the service is restarted, it's basically not running, its image is not blocked on the file system and can be rewritten. Okay, so you can write a script that triggers this DOS condition, service crashes, and before it is restarted, you can quickly rewrite its image. So this can be really tricky, but still, in many cases, there are ways to do that. And I will give you guidance on where to find more information about that. The same thing happens sometimes with scheduled jobs. There was a typical vulnerability in Windows Server environment, which is now fixed and is not widely available on Windows machines. But one example was that a non-privileged user in the system actually was able to create a privileged job, yeah, scheduled for periodic or one-time runs in the system. This also was the case in Windows environment. Okay, one other thing that you might be interested in, if it's a part of your rules of engagement, is covering the tracks of your presence in the system. So there are these two methods to do that. So there are tools. Audit policy control just disables auditing, filling in event logs in the system on a specific IP address or host. Yeah, so locally you can do that, or you have permission and you can do that remotely on that IP address, provided the credentials. And there is EL save utility that in this case does not save anything. It just clears a specific category of events in the event log on the specific machine. Okay, this is quite nasty. Yeah, so normally whiteheads do not do that, because we have engagement letters. We have nothing to fear, but sometimes it's just the part of rules of engagement, just to make the job more realistic and fully imitate the actions of potential perpetrators. So as to post-exploitation and lateral movement within the systems under Windows, of course, as I mentioned, there is a large collection, large variety of post-exploitation modules in Metasploit. They are available from Meterpreter. So once you can run Meterpreter on the system, you can use almost all of them, depending on the architecture you are in. There are also public exploits for that. So there is a whole local exploitation category on the ExploitDB website, which is also, as well as Metasploit, is now hosted by Rapid7. And there are different Windows command line tools that may help you work with services, with scheduled jobs, and collect information about the environment you have found yourself in, right? Of course, there is Windows Management Instrumental Command Line, I guess, yeah, so WMIC stands for that. So this is like the older way to control Windows remotely and locally from the command line. Now it's largely replaced by PowerShell cmdlets. And there is this sc command that stands for service control, I guess. So sc will show you the list of services, their status. You can restart services from there. You can create your new services and so on. So pretty much the same thing that net service does, but more easily and more nicely, I guess. Net, of course, is one of the oldest command line tools in Windows. Net view shows you different information about the local machine and remote machines as well. Net use lets you connect and use file shares. Net session lists you the information of logged in users, current sessions, the parameters, and so on. And net service, of course, operates it controls the services in the system. PowerShell, yeah, it demands a separate book, I guess, or a separate course. Of course, you have to go figure out what it is if you don't have an impression about that yet. It will strike you, yeah, how many very useful things you can do with PowerShell on Windows. For system administrators, it's a must to master this tool. For penetration testers as well, since it's widely available, it can and should be used by the attackers too. Final considerations about local access. There is this this principle, I would say, yeah. So it stayed true, yeah, it stayed correct for many years, so we can say that that's like a principle in offensive security discipline. Once you have access physically, you can escalate to any logical level of access. Okay, so once you can get a hold of a system physically, you can get to it and spend some time around it. That basically can guarantee you circumventing any security controls, any logical security controls in the system. So one of the examples of that is this tool, Conboot. It's a commercially available tool. It started as a free project, but now it costs some money. It's totally affordable, and I suggest that you have it in your toolkit. What it does, it just gives you a media to boot from. So it's basically just a boot partition. You can put it on a flash drive or rip it on a CD. Yeah, so you can choose the media you like, or you can just use an ISO to boot your virtual machine from it. And the nice name for that, the nice purpose for that tool is password recovery. But basically what it does, it allows you to boot from this media on the machine that you don't normally have access to, and then on Windows, for example, pressing Shift for a few times, just have a console window, yeah, of the system, of the local system. So run local system privileged commands from zero authentication. So that's quite nasty, yeah. So this is the tool that I have used, for example, in this instance when I have access to hypervisor, but had to proceed further and compromise the domain controller that was running on it. So I just inserted this ISO, virtually inserted this ISO into this domain controller virtual machine, rebooted that, and got VNC console to it, and pressed Shift for a couple of times, and then by this net utility, yeah, I have created a new user for myself, put it into local administrator group, rebooted the machine once again, and then just connected via RDP and proceeded from that. So having local access, local administrator access to the domain controller basically means that you have compromised all the infrastructure, at least the Windows-based infrastructure of your client. So this was quite useful in that particular case.